Have you ever felt that your games are more difficult to analyze compared to some Grandmasters games? Have you ever felt that chess is made easy by some of your favorite Grandmasters, yet you are not quite capable to apply those concepts and win those games that you deserve? Well, the problem might not entirely lie in our understanding of the game, but rather the principles that we seemingly ignore a little too much. Hello everyone, I'm Ren from the Bachelor of Chess. Today I'll be doing something quite different, and that is we're going to take a look at common principles in chess known by you and me, and have been taught to beginners since forever it feels like, get breached by even some of the top grandmasters in the world. Now of course there are famous sayings from grandmasters left and right that says a good player follows all the rules, but the strongest players knows how to break them. But unfortunately the one that we'll be seeing today are outright breaking principles that leads to unfavorable position or even losing position. And so without further ado, let's just get ahead with the game. As you can see from the game that I prepared, this is actually between Antoaneta Stefanova and also Valentina Gunina from the recently concluded Women Grand Prix, where the first two winners of that tournament placed in the Candidates Tournament. And if you don't know what Candidates Tournament is, please look it up. It's a very important tournament, but the point of this is actually just to tell you that even at this stage, where the game seems very important, there are some people who will try new things to the point where they are actually just violating chess principles. To make it more interesting, I just want to ask you guys, what move would you play in this position to actually just protect this knight? As you can see, this knight is actually attacked twice by the bishop and also the queen. Write it down in the comments below before we proceed with the video. But Stefanova tried out pawn to f4 in this position. Now pawn to f4 does protect the knight, but in doing pawn to f4 we've opened up new avenue for the bishop to come in. As you can see, there are actually very weak dark square diagonal that the bishop can actually occupy because the pawn has just left to f4. So the first principles that even grandmasters will violate is moving your pawn in front of your king, especially after the castle. In this position, something like rook to e1 will be a better try, because after pawn to f4, this actually opens up the dark square diagonal, and it also fails from a tactical perspective, because black here can place knight to d5, attacking the pawn on f4, and this is forcing white to play pawn to g3 due to tactical reason. If anything else is played rather than g3, something like pawn to a3 for example, just to pass a move, then knight to f4, rook to f4, this knight is still hanging, and this will not be good for white, and so pawn to g3 is definitely forced in this position. But by moving the pawn to g3, you've opened up another new diagonal for your king to be attacked. As you can see, the light squared bishop from black here is ready to be transferred to b7, where it controls the light squared diagonal. In fact, the very plan will be bishop to b7, queen to b6, pawn to c5, pawn to c4. This bishop, dark squared bishop here can be on this diagonal, it can be on this diagonal. All in all, you'll see that the diagonal will be sliced and diced by black's pieces over there. In fact, the next few moves is based on the fact that Gunina is able to actually blow up the center by playing pawn to e5 in this position. Pawn to e5 looks to break the center of the board. Of course, if white doesn't take, the position will be more kaput than ever, with black just munching all the pawns right here. And if white takes the pawn on e5, the goal is to take the pawn with the rook, sacrificing exchange, and after knight e5, bishop to e5, you can see that the whole diagonal is actually being sliced by black's pieces. The rook's being attacked has to move. But the point is, you can control the dark square diagonal and also just control the light square diagonal as well. But instead what Gunina did was taking on e5 with the bishop, and after queen to g2 in this position, we can see that Gunina just removed one of the attacker, which is still very dangerous for black, but I would prefer the earlier version with a bishop available on e5, attacking the dark square diagonal over here. But fast forward ahead, Gunina did not actually win this game, and eventually made this game a little bit more difficult by playing pawn to g6. The same mistake that Antoaneta did with pushing the pawn in front of the king, and with that actually gave up the entire dark square diagonal for white to attack. This is so bad, to the point where the move to stop checkmate is pawn to f6, and after this move here, bishop to b5, we can see that Gunina is just down a piece, and Stefanova was able to quickly exchange off all the pieces she needs, where she's just up 2 pawns on the queen side, and when she pushed that pawn up the board, it's just going to be promoted to a new queen, while the pawn here on the king's side will never actually promote for black. So as you can see, there are no efforts that black can do in this position to actually save this game. And fast forwarding to this position, where black tried to push all his pawn on the king's side, and there are no breakthrough, black resigned in this position. Now in this position, to stop the checkmate in 1, it would have been better for Gunina to play pawn to h6. This does not give up the light square diagonal, preserve the dark square diagonal. Of course, if queen to g4, we just play pawn to g6. As you can see, there are no easy way to get into black's position, and if queen to h4, just pawn to g5, the rook protects the pawn, everything will be fine. And if the queen keeps moving back and forth, then suddenly there's already queen to b6 in this position, threatening pawn to c4, discovery with the check again. Just to show you what it means on the board, if white plays queen to f5, suddenly there's already pawn to c4, check, and if king to h1 for example, there's already knight to f4, again discovery check. Well, white is actually pretty much checkmate right here. The only move to stop it is bishop to e4, but after bishop to e4, yeah, this is just checkmate, not to mention the queen right here is hanging. But Gunina, in the pressure protecting her king from checkmate, she pushed the pawn and gave up the most important diagonal and went on to lose this game. So that's advice number 1, do not move your pawn in front of your king. We'll move on to the next game. And the next game for the list is also from the very same tournament, played between Kateryna Lagno and Alina Kashlinskaya. Both are very strong masters, but let's see how they did in this game. And so again, the opening phase is what I'm just going to skip. It will come out as a theory of its own in another series, but the point is after rook to e1, this position has become a little bit more like a Slav position. And after the bishop is out on f5, which is the logical move for Slav players in this position, Kateryna continues with queen to b3, which is trying to take the pawn on b7, put pressure on the pawn on d5, so far so good for both sides, until Alina plays knight to a6, and after the capture in the center, Kateryna brought back the queen to d1. Now who will be able to guess the second principle that Kateryna Lagno actually breached? And it is actually moving your pieces multiple times in the opening phase. As you saw what happened, she moved his queen to b3, and moved it back to d1, losing tempo. This move is so bad because after knight to b4, the bishop is forced to go to e2 or f1. If you had tried something else like knight to c3, then there will be discovery like c3, knight to d3, you'll be losing a piece. Knight to a3 makes the same thing, which is knight to f2, attacking the queen, attacking the bishop, what will lose? So the bishop to e2 is forced, but the problem is after rook to c8, you're trying to attack on a c2, which trapped the rook on a1, forcing another knight to a3 in this position. And after just few moves ahead, you can see that white actually has an awkward position of bishop and knight being on the rim of the board. She keeps retreating her pieces like bishop to f1, queen to d1, while Alina is trying to advance all her forces and try to put pressure on Kateryna. But with this said, Alina did not win the game again. In fact, if you fast forward, Alina actually traded off the bishop for the knight on a3, and after the takes plays a blunder of queen to a3, because here there's a move that can expose the king very much, and that is knight to g7, taking the pawn, exposing the king because the king cannot take on g7 due to the fact that discovery on h6 with the bishop, the queen will be lost next turn. But even if black doesn't take, the position is too much open for white's turn to actually push all the pawn on the king's side to rip apart black's king side. And I'm very sure if we are all playing this position, we'll be able to win this kind of position as well, because the position is just so torn for black. In fact, after rook to g6, Alina resigned this position. Again, she couldn't take the rook earlier on f6, because then there's bishop to e5, just forking the queen and the king, or should I say skewering the queen to the king. But indeed, it was Alina who was pressing in this position, but traded off one of her attacking pieces, which looks at h2, to the knight that is useless sitting on a3. In this move, everything is good. Retreating the bishop to f8, retreating the bishop to b8, even taking on f5 is good. But it is what it is. Let's move on to the next game then. Now moving on to our third principle, and that is castle before you commit to changing the structure of the game. Now who would have thought that something as simple as castling your king and get your king to safety will be violated by one of the famous grandmasters in the world, and make it to the best game of the list, no less. But with all that said, I think this game is based on opening preparation that the Chinese player Wen Yang has already prepared. Now it's very common theory in Sicilian defense that if you brought your knight to c3 and play pawn to d3, black's just going to storm you on the queen's side and play the bishop to b7 to counter the bishop on g2. In fact, Artemiev here can play pawn to b4, and after knight to e2, d5, bishop to e7, I think this is just a pretty good position. Instead plays d6, a fine move, but a bit slow in his position. Again, I don't really know this theory so much, but I do know that you're trying to attack on the queen side, and so it's just b4 is a pretty much good approach to go to. But d6 is played, a bit slow, but it's a solid move. Here Wen Yang just castled, but as the move progresses, you can see that Wen Yang is actually just trying to expand on the king's side, and pawn to e5 just proved to do that. What Artemiev should have done is to ignore the threat of pawn push to e5 and place knight to d7 himself, and say after pawn takes d6, we can just take with our bishop, and everything seems fine. Instead, what Artemiev did was changing the structure, and after knight to d7, queen to g4. Again, I kept saying changing structure, but that actually means moving your pawn or capturing a pawn to the point where it changes the structure of the game that opens up new lines, either for your opponent or for yourself. For example, taking on e5 here will release this bishop along this long diagonal, so that's actually changing the structure, one way of changing the structure of course. Please note if the knight moves to d7, this is not actually changing the structure because of course the pawn here is not moving. This bishop has no line to this diagonal, and so it'll be safe. But Artemiev changes structure, and after queen to g4, plays pawn to g6, right? Of course, just countering the attack of taking on g7, you play pawn to g6 to protect the pawn. But here's the move that is so broken that smashes the entire internet when it was played. Can you guess what the move is? Would you like to pause the video for a bit and actually just find yourself? The move is rook takes f7. Just magnificent rook sacrifice. And it's really those type of sacrifice when you don't checkmate, you lose. So after king to f7, we do see rook to f1 check. Of course, king g7 will have lined up the queen with the king. Not to mention the bishop here is actually aiming at the long diagonal here as well. Knight can come to f4, and so that will be bad. Artemiev chose king e8. But Wen Yang continues with queen takes e6. And even after knight to e5, he just infiltrated with the rest of his pieces that is active and checked the king on e8, preventing the king from running to f8, by the way, because knight to g6 check and this kind of position after bishop to h6 is a checkmate for black's king. So king d8 is basically forced, the best defense. But after queen to d5, since the e8 square is covered by the knight, the only move here to block the check is queen to d6. Again, after bishop to e7, you will have seen something like knight to e6. Not good. So queen to d6. And here, there's basically a stunning move that is played by Wen Yang. Again, would you like to pause the video a bit? And that is the move, bishop to c5. Taking on the fact that e8 and d7 square is covered, and after queen to d5, we're not even going to take the queen, we're not going to take the bishop. We are going to insert the move bishop to b6, and it's check, and it's mate. Just one magnificent game based on the fact that Vladislav Artemiev did not castle before he changed the structure of the game. Although I thought this game is basically just preparation, I think it deserves its own credit because not every day you will see moves such as rook to f7 this position, just straight out giving out your rook. This has become one of my best games in the list. Tell me in the comments below if this has become one of your best game as well. Now the fourth game that we're going to see today is just going to be a bit special because I'm first going to hide the identity of the players for you guys to guess it. This game is very famous blitz game, and so perhaps when you browse YouTube too much you'll actually just know this game. But it starts out with white playing knight to f3 and black quickly transposes into king's in defense with white playing pawn to h3. Now I'm not going to comment too much on this one because I'm not a King's Indian player myself. I probably don't know what the heck is the best move right here, but I do not think bishop to d7 is the best move from black. From the opening perspective, I think black usually will take on f3 and let white recapture with the bishop here, or with the knight is actually very fine. But retreating bishop to d7 plus taking on c5 actually imposes a very huge lag in black's development of pieces. And even worse, when knight c4 was played, f6 in response was given, further lagging the development of the pieces. Now there's a very important concept here to remember related to the principles, and that is if you play a position that lacks space in general, you want to bring your pieces out to trade off most of your opponent's active pieces to compensate for your lack of space. But as you can see, the last three moves played by black is basically moves that retreat pieces or pawn moves that does not develop pieces at all. And so here, white is just seizing the chances to do this. Pawn to d6, trying to hit black in the face. Obvious idea, if pawn takes d6, knight takes d6 check. This is not going to be very good for black. And so knight to c8. But even after these moves, and not going in that, you can see that black's position is actually pretty crap. He lacks space. And after queen to b3, the threat is clear. If black try to castle, then there's knight to e5 anyway. This is giving a check. And after king to h8, we can see something like knight to f7 check. And even if there's no smothered mate, this is still very annoying for black. Black continues with a very awkward move, and I suppose by now you have remembered whose game this is actually. This game is played by Wesley So and Garry Kasparov, an ultimate blitz challenge. And Wesley, after playing rook to d1, pawn to b5, sacrifices the knight on e5. Because obviously, after taking two pawns, this bishop is also hanging on c6. After rook to b8, bishop to a4, queen to b7, which is another blunder from Kasparov. Not going to go in depth, but rook to c6, after knight c6, queen e6, knight to e7, and after bishop to c5, it is evident that this knight is pinned. And so after rook to c8, we take the knight on e7, knight is not able to capture, so queen takes, but the rook's hanging on c8, and Garry Kasparov here just resigned the game. Just amazing game, I think, from Wesley So, taking the advantage of the fact that the pieces on the king's side is not well developed, and you're able to create an attack on the center of the board and try to infiltrate that way. So develop the pieces, guys. And a very quick last game that is going to be from Zhansaya Abdumalik and also Stefanova and Antoaneta. The very same tournament as the first two games, which is the FIDE Grand Prix. Features of what I say, very interesting opening choices from black, from Stefanova. And it is actually a sideline of Scotch that I really hate of bringing the queen to f6 from black. And I think here you've just all guessed out the last principle that Grandmasters actually break. And that is actually bringing your queen out early in the opening phases. The problem is this is actually a sideline from Scotch game, and this is actually pretty legit for black to play. However, I do not like it at all from black's perspective. Of course, he has a clear idea of bringing bishop to c5, checkmate down f2, but come on, Zhansaya Abdumalik, a strong international master at the time, now a grandmaster, is not going to miss it. She plays knight to b3, stopping bishop to c5 once and for all. And black here is just trying to find new target to attack. But as you can see, it's not easy to attack white's pieces at all with the queen alone. And right here in a position where I think black has some chances to actually trade off the knight and take the pawn, Stefanova did not do that. Instead, Stefanova brought her bishop back to d6, and after queen to h5, it is clear that Zhansaya Abdumalik is on her journey to actually trap the black queen. Now black goes a5, but after castle and bishop g5, we can see that the queen is actually lacking in spaces for her to go to. In fact, here after bishop to f4, queen to f6, we have pawn to e5. The move was not to fork the queen and the bishop, but rather to allow knight to e4 to come into the position. And after queen to f5, we see knight to d6 check. This is forking the king and the queen. And after the pawn is taken, the queen is lost by the bishop here. And so I believe the rest is just history. We don't have to continue the game, but eventually it reaches out to this position, and Stefanova just resigned. So the point of this video is really to teach us to basically just play a sound move in the opening, such as developing your pieces. Don't move your pieces twice or more in the opening phase. Don't bring your queen out, which is the more powerful of pieces, because it's going to be a target. Castle kingside to safety. And as long as we keep adhering to those principles, especially as beginners, I think we'll all win games that we need to win. In fact, just following and adhering to these 5 rules will actually just bring you to a better opening phase to play, an easier opening phase to play. Easier opening phase means easier middle game to explore, and to come up with a plan to kill your opponent as quickly as possible. And so I hope you learned a lot in this video. As usual, if you like it, please press the subscribe button to motivate me to make this video a lot more. We'll have more videos exploring on openings, but we'll occasionally do strategic gameplay or mid-game play or end games as well. So do stay tuned for that. Otherwise, thanks for watching. See you soon.